Injuries, trades, uncertain depth charts. All of those factors have changed player outlooks within just the past week, and that's why we're focused on them today. We want to make sure every single pick in your fantasy draft counts, including those late rounders that you might think are throwaways. Those picks can turn into the biggest winners of the season, but only if you find the right guys. So, we're delivering one more round of fantasy sleepers in an all-new Draft Sharks podcast right now. Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here, and we're on the verge of the last draft weekend before the start of the NFL season. So we're zeroing in on some last-minute sleepers. These are 6 late-round targets that we either haven't talked about much to this point on the show, or in some cases haven't even discussed them at all. So we're looking primarily at factors that might have changed these players' outlooks over just the past week or two. We're talking about any trades from teams, any injuries, any playing time trends at the end of the preseason. But Jared, before we get to the planned list of players, can I call attention to Kendre Miller one more time real quick as we get to the verge of this NFL season? A guy that we've talked about for the past 2 years. He has remained among our sleeper calls for this season. You can find him in our articles on draftsharks.com. But we finally got confirmation with the roster cutdowns that Kendre Miller is the number 2 in New Orleans. And not only that, Kellen Moore highlighted a steady offseason, which is quite different than what we've seen from Miller in the past.
Yeah, I had even stopped drafting Kendre after the Saints, drafted Devin Neal, signed Cam Akers, brought back Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I'm all the way back in now as one of your last few picks in drafts. Fresh start for Kendre, which he needed. Dennis Allen was not a fan of this guy for whatever reason, but sounds like the new staff is in on him. So clear number 2 running back behind Alvin Kamara, who we like, but he's getting up there in years. He's missed time with injury most seasons of his career. So Kendre Miller looking like one of the better handcuff picks late in drafts.
And I mean, Alvin Kamara should cede some work. Like, New Orleans would be in better shape if they don't have Alvin Kamara getting too much work throughout the season. So we'll see exactly what that means. But really a why not pick Kendre Miller at the end of your draft. But like I said, we had a list of planned players coming into the show. That did not include Kendre Miller. That's a throw in. Jared, hit me with a running back that we were already planning to talk about.
Yeah, Bhayshul Tuten is my first sleeper here. And, if I could recommend one target in the double-digit rounds of your drafts this weekend or whenever you're drafting, it would be Bhayshul Tuten for me. And the Jags backfield is a situation that's probably cost me more sleep than any other spot in the NFL this offseason, and it's honestly still murky heading into week 1. We still have Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby on this roster, despite, there being some whispers that the Jags could be looking to trade one of those guys, which is still possible, right? At this point, it's probably not going to happen before week 1, but definitely in season as we get injuries to some backfields, it's possible one of those veterans is moved. But I stepped back recently, like after the preseason and after final cuts, and just kind of reassessed a lot of situations. And with the Jags backfield, it just brought me back to Tuten, who was handpicked by this new regime. Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby are holdovers from the previous coaching staff, the previous GM. New GM, James Gladstone, he pinpointed Tuten as a target in his interview with the Jags for this GM job. Like, they asked him, who's a day 3 prospect that you like, based on your process. Tuten was the guy he pinpointed. They go out and take Tuten with one of the very first picks of day 3 in round 4. Just a really exciting prospect, averaged 5.7 yards per carry at Virginia Tech over the last 2 seasons. Top 5 among 31 combine running backs last year in both yards after contact per attempt and missed tackles forced per attempt. And then at the combine, 4.32 second 40-yard dash at 206 pounds. It gives him a 100th percentile speed score. So super athlete, explosive runner in college. I thought he was Jacksonville's best running back this preseason. I think the PFF grades would back that up. And again, it's just a backfield we want to invest in. We've talked about this, how many fantasy points the Bucs backfield produced last year. And I'm not even sure I had realized this, but I was writing up Tuten for our sleepers article. And, last year's Bucs finished 4th in the NFL in rushing yards as a team, 3rd in yards per carry. That team finished dead last in both of those categories the previous year under Dave Canales. That's the type of boost that I think Liam Cohen could bring to this Jags running game. And I think by maybe October, at least over the second half of the season, I think Bhayshul Tuten is going to be the lead runner in this backfield.
Well, and to be fair, the other big difference between those 2 seasons of Bucs running backs was Bucky Irving arriving. So yes, Bhayshul Tuten could be Jacksonville's version of Bucky Irving. And that's what we liked about Bucky Irving last year. We didn't know what his role was going to be heading into the season, but we knew he liked the talent. We knew that there was potential opportunity. And eventually that opportunity turned into a starting role for a guy that was the best runner in the backfield. Now, we'll see how the Jacksonville backfield starts out this season, but I don't think there's any indication that the Jaguars are in love with either Travis Etienne or Tank Bigsby. I'm sure that they would love to trade either of those guys. I would guess the fact that neither has been moved yet signals that they just haven't really gotten a deal, and they don't need to. They could hold both players through the end of the season. They don't need Tuten to work out right away, and that's what makes this an unclear backfield. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that drafters make is saying, I don't know who's getting the ball there. I'm just going to pass on the whole thing. If it's truly an unclear situation, there is absolutely opportunity in that. You can take any member of it, especially when they're all sliding down the board. You can take the latest member of it in ADP. That is Tuten to this point. He's RB50 by our PPR consensus ADP. That's 4 rounds behind Travis Etienne. It's 2 rounds behind Tank Bigsby. So if you don't like either of those guys, then you don't even have to have an opinion on Tuten. Just stash him on your bench, see what happens. If you get 3 weeks into the season and he's barely touching the ball, drop him for somebody else. Feel free. Just, watch to see any signals that something's going to change from there on. We've loved Tuten since he was a prospect. We love the opportunity in Jacksonville, and we love the upside of the offense. So that should all come together to make you want to get a piece. And I agree that Tuten is a very attractive piece at the current backfield prices.
Give him at least like 4 or 5 weeks before you go dropping him. Again, I don't think this is going to be an immediate thing. I do think you're going to see Etienne and Bigsby open the season as Jacksonville's top 2 backs, but I just think Tuten's talent is going to win out eventually.
And without getting too far into the regular season strategy, you could drop somebody like that, for the week 1 pickup if you don't have another comfortable drop, and then stash him again before the breakout happens in the season. Like if we get 2-3 weeks of Tuten not getting meaningful touches and not getting picked up in those leagues, then go ahead and stash him on your bench and wait to see what happens. There's room for making moves like that. But, one other key along with the upside of these players is that if they don't work out, and they won't all work out, otherwise they wouldn't all be going in the late rounds. If they don't work out, you can drop them for something early in the year that will help your roster more. Now we're going to move on to the Washington backfield. And of course, the big change there was Brian Robinson Jr. going from starter to we don't want you around anymore, which is really a surprising drop. And it's made for a lot of change in the way drafters are treating this backfield. But the biggest difference it's made is boosting Jacory Croskey-Merritt from a guy that had some slight buzz just following the draft to some slowly building buzz throughout the offseason to all of a sudden somebody that everybody wants to draft. And he's going now inside the single-digit rounds. I think that the reaction to Jacory Croskey-Merritt in the wake of the Brian Robinson Jr. trade is pushing him out of true sleeper status. I'm not saying don't draft him, but he's now going, according to our ADP, ahead of J.K. Dobbins, ahead of Zach Charbonnet, ahead of Cam Scadaboo, Javonte Williams, about a round ahead of Austin Eckler, more than a round ahead of Quinshon Judkins. That might all wind up being fair because he does look like an intriguing prospect. But I think it's important that we remember this guy is not only completely unproven at the NFL level, but we didn't even really see that much from him at the college level. So he handled 13 touches in all of 2024 because of eligibility issues. 209 total touches over the past 2 years in college. Before those 2 seasons at the FBS level, he had 2.5 years at Alabama State, half year because 2020 was COVID shortened. Over that span at Alabama State, he averaged only 10.5 carries per game, 3.7 yards per carry, 27 total receptions, no more than 120 carries in a season at Alabama State, no more than 13 receptions in any college season across 5 years at the various schools. So maybe he's about to be a very good NFL contributor. Maybe he's about to make a difference for fantasy, but there's nothing beyond maybe for Jacory Croskey-Merritt. So that's why I'm instead highlighting Chris Rodriguez as the sleeper here, because whereas Croskey-Merritt is going at RB34 inside of round 8 by ADP, Chris Rodriguez is round 20 by our PPR ADP. Now, it's a little bit earlier if you look at underdog numbers, but still many rounds separate those guys. And Rodriguez, in his 3rd year with Washington, has not run the ball very much to this point. So we don't want to overrate him as a player, but in that limited work, he has at least been pretty good, 4.9 yards per rush. If we look back to his college days, he was at Kentucky for 5 years, averaged 6.2 yards per carry across his career there. Also not much of a receiver, just 32 career receptions in college. So I don't want to overemphasize how good I think Chris Rodriguez is, because I think if he were a standalone sleeper that were on the verge of a breakout, I think we would have seen more of that in the league so far. My message here is don't get too caught up on the name that everybody's highlighting. Instead, when you're looking at this uncertain situation, consider Chris Rodriguez at the end of your draft. Consider Austin Eckler, who is now going behind Jacory Croskey-Merritt. And I'm not excited about Eckler as a fantasy prospect, but he's easily the most proven guy in this backfield and could, just by virtue of how it's set up now, get a bunch more touches than he did last year and be decent for us at his draft price.
The biggest takeaway for me here is that there's three guys involved. I think we know Eckler is in his role as the primary pass catching back, probably the guy who's going to dominate pass catching work in this backfield. Because like you said, Matt, neither Chris Rodriguez nor Jacory Croskey-Merritt have much experience in the passing game. And you have Croskey-Merritt, you have Chris Rodriguez, who Dan Quinn basically came out and said about a week ago that Rodriguez is at least going to open the season as their short yardage and goal line back. So, we're talking about a 3-man committee here. And, last year, Robinson and Eckler both scored as RB3s. You had Brian Robinson finish 30th in PPR points per game. Austin Eckler was 32nd in PPR points per game. But again, that's just with 2 guys involved. If you get 3 guys involved and that continues throughout the season, it's going to be tougher for any of these guys to, again, kind of, I think, ascend beyond RB3 status. I think the upside case for Croskey-Merritt is that he gets the Robinson role. Maybe he pushes Rodriguez aside eventually and is just a more efficient player than Robinson, which is definitely possible because Robinson has just been kind of meh as far as efficiency stuff goes. So that's how you can see, I think, Croskey-Merritt maybe start to flirt with like RB2 numbers. But that's a lot of things that have to break his way for that to happen. So I'm treating him as like a low end RB3 at this point in drafts. I think you're going to see his draft range vary pretty wildly. You're going to see him go in the 7th, 8th round. You could see him drop to the 10th, 11th, 12th round. That's where I start to get interested. I think, round 10, round 11 is where I would start to consider Croskey-Merritt.
Yeah, I'm willing to look at him in like a home league level draft where I think he'll go closer to that range. I have a main event draft coming up for FFPC. I expect that he's going to go a lot earlier than I would want to take him there, because you'll get somebody saying, hey, I'm trying to win the whole thing, and this is a guy that can win the whole thing. I don't believe that that's in him. Maybe eventually, but I don't think that we're about to see that kind of season from Jacory Croskey-Merritt. We'll see. Total unknown. I could be wrong. Maybe he winds up being a guy that you needed to have, but just it kind of embrace the uncertainty and look at it in the later rounds, whether that's Eckler, whether that's Chris Rodriguez, or whether JCM slides to you, which I think we should probably start calling him either that or Bill, so that it's a lot easier than saying the full name for this guy.
That's the other thing with JCMs. I think you're paying like a 2-round premium just because of his name. I mean, he has a hyphen in his name. That's worth like a round. And then the nickname Bill, I think that's worth another round. So just know you're paying 2 rounds extra just because he has such a cool name.
The next guy was a name a couple years ago in college football, and then he had a rough final season, slid to late in the draft, but a resurgent name now, Jared, because of what's going on around him on the Dolphins roster.
Yeah, it's Ollie Gordon. And, this one hurts, honestly, because I have been drafting the hell out of Jalen Wright. I think he's one of my highest owned running backs in best ball, and that's not looking too good right now because Jalen Wright went down, some sort of leg injury. But we don't even have the details on his injury. But he went down he went down in mid-August. And we just learned today, actually, August 28th, we're recording. Mike McDaniel said that Wright needed a minor procedure. He's going to be out sometime until September-ish. Was the word McDaniel used. So he's not going to play week 1. He's probably going to miss multiple games. He could miss 3-4 games. That gives Ollie Gordon just this runway to claim that number 2 job in Miami. And honestly, Gordon might have been winning that anyways at this point because he pretty clearly outplayed Jalen Wright in the preseason. Gordon had a really nice preseason, 4.8 yards per carry, 3.9 yards after contact per attempt. He also beat Jalen Wright in missed tackles forced per attempt, PFF rushing grade. Like Ollie Gordon was just the better runner this preseason. And I don't think Wright entered the summer as like this locked in number 2, right? Like he was kind of minimally used last year. He was a day 3 pick, same as Ollie Gordon. So, at this point, I think we should consider Ollie Gordon the number 2 running back in Miami. And that at minimum makes him a strong handcuff behind Devon Achane, who dealt with injuries last year, is already dealing with a calf injury now. He's an undersized back. And then, as I think we were talking about with Jalen Wright for a lot of the offseason, there's a chance that Gordon even has some standalone value. Dolphins running backs outside of Achane last year averaged 9.9 carries and 1.9 targets per game. If Gordon can, soak up most of that and be efficient, it could be enough to make like an RB3 flex play, especially in non PPR, half PPR leagues.
And by the way, that was a broken version of the Miami offense. The year before, we got plenty of fantasy value out of both Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane. So there's room for multiple running backs to help our teams here. I hope that the season is not lost for Jalen Wright. It sounds like the Dolphins are trying to tell us that it won't be. September-ish to me means that we shouldn't expect him to do anything before October, at least in terms of worthwhile production in games. I'm a big fan of Mike McDaniel, but it's annoying to say a small procedure, a lower body injury. Just say what it is. I mean, all the medical stuff for these guys is public anyway. Stop playing coy or, I don't know. I don't know what the motivation is here, but it's annoying. So Ollie Gordon is going to be interesting. Mid-round 14 ADP in our PPR consensus ADP right now. That puts him just behind Ray Davis and Tyler Algier, just ahead of Dylan Sampson and Rico Dowdle. I think that's a fair range. I'm happy to see the resurgence for Ollie Gordon if we can separate it from the Jalen Wright thing. I did take him on some early season, like pre-NFL draft best ball teams, so I'm happy for the potential impact on those squads and curious to see how things wind up working for all these Miami guys. If you already drafted Jalen Wright and you need a replacement already, we're about to get into waiver wire season, and we're going to have multiple ways that we're assisting you in managing that waiver wire. One is our weekly Tuesday show is going to soon be flipping over to a waiver wire focus ahead of the week 2 NFL slate. So that'll just be waiver wire show every single week. You want to be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or your favorite audio platform so that you will know as soon as that show drops, you'll be ready before that week's waiver run in your league or across your leagues if you run multiple. And if you do multiple leagues, then the free agent finder is only going to be more valuable. It is the only way, honestly, that I can manage waivers for all of the teams that I have to manage throughout the season. An absolutely invaluable tool, not only because it tracks that specific league's rosters and who's available and who's not, but you can also quickly check for a player's availability across all of your synced teams. At some point this year, there's going to be a big midweek injury, and everybody who plays fantasy is going to go try to figure out if that backup running back is on the waiver wire in their leagues. You could either go to every one of your leagues, check waivers and see if he's there, or you can go to the free agent finder, type in the name, and it'll be like, yeah, it's available. That guy's available in these 5 leagues. He's not available in these 4 leagues. So have at it. I can't tell you how many times that has helped me get ahead of league mates. So if you're already subscribed to draftsharks.com, then your September auto renewal is going to cover you for that free agent finder and everything else throughout the season. Just because the draft might be behind you doesn't mean we're going to stop helping your team. Jared, now we're going to switch over to wide receivers. And this first one has kind of, 2 interest points here. So I want to start on the positive. Marvin Mims in the final preseason game got the kind of usage that we were hoping for. And honestly, I don't even know if it's fair to say I was hoping for it. I just assumed that it wasn't possible for him, because even when we saw Marvin Mims produce fantasy-wise late last year, it came on unattractive usage, the kind of usage that makes you say, yeah, the numbers were good, but that's not sustainable because they're not putting him on the field enough. So when we finally saw this final preseason game and Marvin Mims running near full time in route share, that to me is the one missing piece. We already like the prospect. We already like the opportunity of an offense that had Cortland Sutton and not much else behind him as far as pass catchers go. So if you then throw in near full-time playing time for Marvin Mims, I'm in. That was my only hurdle. And especially if we can still get that kind of guy in late wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6 range. Now, we got a new challenge this week when he left practice with a groin injury Wednesday. Now, so we're going to have to watch and see just how serious that is. I think there's room for that to even be a slight positive on his draft value. Not that a groin injury is ever good for a player, but the team is initially saying we're not that worried. There is still a week and a half before week 1. And the range in which we're drafting Marvin Mims, we're not drafting him to start in week 1. So I don't really care if he's limited for the first week, 2 weeks, whatever like that. If it truly proves to be minor though, and pushes him down draft boards, and I can now get him as a late wide receiver 6 even, that only makes it more attractive to stash Mims on a bench and then see what happens. See if we do get that high level route share into the season.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, we need Mims healthy to see what his role is going to be when he is healthy, but he's not someone you're drafting to use in week 1 lineups, probably not even week 2 or 3. We kind of want to see where this role goes before using him. But like you said, Matt, 92% route rate with Bo Nix for Marvin Mims in the preseason. Now, do I think that's going to continue in the regular season? Definitely not. But like, I think it's pretty clear that Mims is going to play a bigger role than he has in the past. He had a 41% route rate as a rookie, and that dropped to a 30% route rate last year. So, that's why he wasn't a fantasy factor. This guy just wasn't getting on the field. But if he can get up to, 75, 80%, which I am betting on at this point based on what we saw in the preseason, then I think Mims can definitely be a fantasy factor. He's been a part-time player through 2 seasons, and he's kind of been using this gadgety role, like a lot of like backfield work, even like short swing passes just to get the ball in his hands. But in college, he was a legit wide receiver. He wasn't a gadget guy at Oklahoma. He led Oklahoma in receiving yards all 3 of his years on campus, including as a true freshman. Career 2.95 yards per route. It's a really strong number. And again, this came on like real wide receiver stuff. He ran 54% of his snaps out wide in college, 46% in the slot. So he was an inside outside guy, but it wasn't, backfield stuff. It wasn't all these, screens. He was a legit wide receiver. I know he's on the small side. That's a limiting factor to some degree, but again, he produced in college, ran a 4.38 40 at the combine, got second round draft capital from Denver. So, I think there's real breakout potential here for Mims in an ascending offense if he's going to be a full-time player.
Yeah, if your reaction to that final preseason game usage is, come on, guys, he's not going to run a route on 90% of dropbacks throughout the season, fine. I don't care. The takeaway here is not, oh my God, Marvin Mims is going to be on the field all the time. It's, they will actually play him more than half the time, because that was the issue. He was like sub 50% late last year. If we can jump from that to 90%, even being a single game possibility, then settling anywhere in that 70 to 80 range would be plenty to make him worthwhile. And like you said, the size probably keeps him from ever being like a number 1 level wide receiver in the NFL, but there's certainly room for him to be the number 2 in Denver, especially now that Evan Ingram's there. That might leave a little bit less room for, these multiple wide receiver sets that puts everybody on the field and spreads targets around a bit more. I also remain a little bit skeptical of Courtland Sutton as like an alpha number 1 receiver. Not that I think he's going to be bad. I just think he's not as good a number 1 wide receiver as some other teams might have. So I think that helps the target upside of the potential number 2 in Denver as well. So, all told, I like stashing Marvin Mims right now and then seeing what happens when we get into the season. Another guy that I'm willing to stash even later, Jalen Coker in Carolina, because the Panthers just traded away Adam Thielen, and that opens up a key slot in the slot for Jalen Coker, who produced impressively as an undrafted rookie and is now sitting at an undrafted ADP. So if I'm there at the very end of my draft and I'm like, should I take a kicker now or should I wait and pick one up ahead of week 1 and take Jalen Coker here? It looks like a good time to take Jalen Coker to me.
Yeah, for sure. And, hand up, I was the anti-Coker guy for much of the offseason. You were trying to push him up on rankings. But, my concern was always the playing time for Jalen Coker, because you still had Adam Thielen there. And I thought, Tedero McMillan and Xavier Legette would be ahead of him just based on draft capital. Playing time's not a concern anymore with Adam Thielen back in Minnesota. GM Dan Morgan said today that Jalen Coker is their slot receiver. So like no question about that anymore. And Coker, he played some in the slot, some outside last year, but he played more in the slot. 61% of his routes came from the slot last year. He averaged more yards per route run from the slot than outside. He was at 1.85 yards per route from the slot last year. That's a really good number for any receiver, especially for a rookie. We talked about on previous shows just how efficient Coker was last year. 70% catch rate, 14.9 yards per catch. His 1.72 yards per route on the season, 4th best among 14 qualifying rookies. So despite being undrafted and not, having this awesome, college profile, he had a really strong rookie season. And it seems like the Panthers are ready to give him a pretty significant role. So Coker has, at this point, even late in the process, I didn't draft enough of him earlier, but he's someone I'm definitely going to try to get a lot of in my, drafts I still have coming up.
Now, he's, of course, still more likely to not help your fantasy team significantly. That's why we're talking about him as a pick among your last few rounds of your draft. But the ultimate upside potential here is what we're targeting. You know, you mentioned how efficient Coker was last year. He outperformed Xavier Legette across categories for their shared time in the same year in which Carolina drafted Legette in round 1 and signed Jalen Coker as an undrafted free agent. And not only that, Coker missed basically all of the pre-training camp time and then portions of training camp for injury. So he had every reason to do absolutely nothing last year. He not only made the roster, he got early season playing time and then outplayed his first round rookie teammate. I'm sure that Carolina would like for Jalen Coker to be the third wide receiver this year. It would love for Tet McMillan to deliver on his top 10 potential. It would love for Legette to develop and be the number 2 wide receiver, at least maybe challenging Tet McMillan in production this year. But we don't know that either of those things is guaranteed. So why not take the what if shot on Jalen Coker, who has delivered some solid professional production, who was an FCS level stud. I mean, I know that we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about Holy Cross receivers, but when you do look back at the numbers and say, where'd this guy come from? It's like, oh, he was actually really good in college. It was just low level, so nobody really paid attention to it. So, you know, like I said, more likely that he's not a big fantasy factor this year, but there are paths to Coker being a helpful member of your fantasy roster this season. Jared, I think the same is true for the last wide receiver on our list. Who you got?
Yeah, Elic Ayomanor, the Titans rookie. And this is definitely the deepest name on our list. I think you probably got to be in a draft that goes 18 plus rounds, or maybe even 20 rounds to make Ayomanor worth drafting. But he's definitely in all leagues, someone I think you keep on your waiver wire watch list, because I think this guy has a chance to be the Titans' number 2 wide receiver over the back half of this coming season at least. You know, we know Calvin Ridley locked in as the number 1. It looks like the Titans see Tyler Lockett as their slot receiver. He played 18 of his 19 snaps this preseason in the slot. So that leaves Ayomanor and Van Jefferson to battle for the other outside spot. And, you know, Jefferson's been in the league for 5 years now, and he's just not very good. He has 24 receiving yards per game for his career. He's reached 400 receiving yards in just one of his 5 NFL seasons. So just not a big roadblock for Ayomanor, who was an interesting prospect. You know, this guy, he's a Canadian who didn't move to the U.S. until high school. He really didn't even play football until college. He played very minimally in high school. Then he breaks out as a redshirt freshman at Stanford, leads that team in 2023 in catches, receiving yards, and touchdowns. You might know Ayomanor from his game against Travis Hunter in Colorado in 2023. He went for 294 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game with Travis Hunter in coverage for a lot of that game. Ayomanor's 2024 wasn't quite as good, but he did still lead the team in catches, receiving yards, and touchdowns. And, you know, he gets round 4 draft capital, decent enough. I just like what I saw from Ayomanor this preseason. He played a lot with Cam Ward. You know, Calvin Ridley didn't play a whole lot in the preseason. That, I think, got Ayomanor some snaps with the first team offense. Actually saw the most targets from anyone on the team from Cam Ward. 6 of Cam Ward's 19 passes went in Ayomanor's direction. So again, it's just, you know, Van Jefferson I don't think is going to last long as the starting receiver for Tennessee. I think you're going to see Ayomanor in there, and there's a path for, you know, him to be the number 2 target in this passing game, because Tyler Lockett does not have much left in the tank. Again, if he's going to be a slot receiver, he's not going to be on the field in 2 wide receiver sets as much as Ayomanor is going to be. So there's a path here. If Cam Ward surprises, I think for Ayomanor to be someone who you're maybe considering as a starter when we start to hit the bye weeks.
Just like Jalen Coker, an undrafted ADP here, so you can take him at the very end of your draft. You can take him not at all and just watch him on waivers, because I don't think either of us is expecting a huge September for Elic Ayomanor. But Jared, he is my 4th most drafted player across positions, across all tournaments on drafters this year. That spans from before the NFL draft through drafts that are currently going. And it, of course, starts with being a prospect that I like. I'm not just going to do that with a wide receiver because of the opportunity if I think the player stinks. The college profile, all the stuff that you mentioned is impressive, and I think sets him up to potentially be pretty good in the pros. The bigger factors for me here, though, are the opportunity in Tennessee, where you mentioned Van Jefferson's ahead of him. That's a good thing. If Van Jefferson is your hurdle between where you are and where you want to be in the lineup, that's a very low hurdle. That's a hurdle I could jump over. The other one is the draft price, which we've already addressed. You know, that's why he's one of my most drafted, because I'm not taking him in round 12. I'm taking him in round 18, 19, 20 in those drafts. Somebody that you want to either stash or watch and then stash later because of the opportunity we talked about. There's just not much ahead of Ayomanor. Even Tyler Lockett, you know, as much as we've loved him through the years, He's old now. He's not the same Tyler Lockett. He's not keeping anybody from doing anything if Ayomanor gets on the field. The fact that it's a rookie quarterback also means Cam Ward doesn't have established rapport with anybody. So we're waiting to see what happens there. Just, I guess kind of even tying back to what we talked about earlier, don't be afraid of the uncertainty in these drafts as you head into the season. Figure out spots where you should embrace that uncertainty, because that can really present the most upside in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it's all about upside in the later rounds. We say it all the time, but all these guys we talked about today, like they're not going to be week one starters for you. There's a chance they don't do anything all year, but they all have like the talent and the opportunity where if things click, they could actually be difference makers for you from the later rounds. And that's what you should be going after, in the later rounds of your drafts.
You can find plenty more sleepers on draftsharks.com right now. We've got several articles available to highlight such players, but more importantly, and to what Jared was just talking about, we have built a system for boosting such players in your actual draft room. That is upside mode, and it takes over after your draft hits the midway point. It accentuates the ceiling projections that we do for every single player, as well as the projected likelihood of hitting that ceiling. The result of that process, you get more attention paid to the potential difference makers late in your draft. Those are the players you want to stash on your bench so that when their breakout does come at some point during the season, you're not fighting the rest of your league on waivers to get these guys. You already have that player on your roster. Why? Because you've got Draft Sharks as your unfair advantage. Hey!